Final Fantasy IV is my Ratatouille. It is the meal that I come back to. I take a bite, and I am instantly reminded of the golden years of my childhood. Final Fantasy IV was the first of the franchise released on the Super Nintendo, and it was also released in the same year in Japan and the US markets alike. It was Square's most ambitious release to date. Final Fantasy IV was released in 1991, but the United States had not yet received Final Fantasy II or Final Fantasy III, as we discussed in their respective videos. With Final Fantasy I having only been released 1 year prior in the United States, the fourth Japanese installment became the second title that the US had encountered. Interestingly, Final Fantasy IV would not be the big break into the US markets that Square was hoping for, but would go on to have a major influence on how future titles would be localized for the US. Final Fantasy IV is the first entry in the series to be entirely story-driven. Characters not only have their own personalities, they also have complete story arcs that flesh them out. We experience their ideals, motives, and actions as they progress through the story. Final Fantasy IV is also the first entry to include a romantic subplot within the main characters. Cecil and Rosa are very much romantically involved, and it is hinted at that Kain also has feelings towards Rosa, which helps craft a more complicated and humanized story. After Final Fantasy IV, romance and more adult themes would start to become more of a focal point in the future titles. The trade-off of having specific character arcs, however, is that it works against the player projecting their own identities onto a blank slate avatar, and the immersion is shifted. The player now more or less just lives out the protagonist's actions in an attempt to relate to one or more of the characters presented in the story, much like how a person would relate to a character in a movie. Storytelling, focus on characters, and a driving narrative throughout the entire game would become the direction that the franchise would focus on from here on out. Final Fantasy IV was not the first Final Fantasy to attempt a narratively driven experience, but it is the first to execute it to the standard that we have come to expect in JRPG storytelling. Speaking of which, I'm going to briefly touch on the story here, so a quick spoiler alert. If you do not wish to have anything of the story spoiled, skip to this time to avoid it. In previous videos, I have referred to the characters of their story as our patron-named protagonists. For this video, I will refer to them in their original names to help prevent some confusion. The game begins with our lead protagonist Cecil, a Dark Knight and captain of the Baron Kingdom's Air Force known as the Red Wings. It opens with Cecil liberating the water crystal from the defenseless people of Mysidia. Upon returning to Baron, Cecil begins to question his deplorable actions committed in the guise of loyalty to the throne. The king sees this as a sign of weakness, and strips Cecil of his rank and orders him and his friend Kain, the captain of the Dragoons, to deliver a package to the nearby city of Mist. On the way there, Kain and Cecil travel through the Mist Cave, slaying the Mist Dragon, a fearsome guardian of its people. Upon arriving at the city of Mist, the package explodes and lays waste to the village. In a rage, the daughter of the Mist Dragon, a young girl named Rydia with the ability to summon Eidolons, which is their name for the godlike creatures of their world, she summons Titan, a menacing tyrant that cracks the very fabric of the planet, causing an earthquake that separates Cecil and Kain from one another. As the story unfolds, Cecil eventually leads the party back to the town of Mysidia, where our story begins to embark on a quest to shed himself of the darkness within and realize his destiny of becoming a paladin. From here, the story continues on a traditional, albeit formulaic, story of redemption for Cecil, of a great threat to the world, and of a love story that overcomes the power of evil. Combat in Final Fantasy IV is quite different from the previous entries. Instead of the party queuing up their actions like a Dungeons & Dragons encounter, and then having the battle played out in order based on their initiative rolls, we are introduced to a brand new system titled the Active Time Battle, or ATB system. The ATB system is based on the specific character's speed attribute, visually displayed as a gauge filling up. When the character's gauge is full, you may select your action and execute it. Enemies also have a hidden speed attribute and the ATB gauge that dictates when they will perform their actions as well. The ATB system has two modes to choose from, active or wait. Wait allows you to select spells or items at your own leisure without the gauge continuing to fill while you menu. This is a nice accessibility option for those who prefer to have more time to make their combat selections. Personally, I like the active system as it makes menuing slowly a detriment, and I like the self-imposed stress of having to menu quickly to get my attacks off in a timely manner. Now, not only do you have to wait till the ATB meter fills up to perform your action, but the implied strength of the action itself can add additional delay. For instance, using the attack command is faster than casting a spell, and casting fire is a much faster execution than casting the stronger spell Firaga, which adds an additional layer of strategy to your choices in battle. You have to weigh the times of the skills in the battle currently underway. Is fire going to be enough to kill the mobs, or should you use a more powerful spell knowing that the enemy will more than likely get in some attacks? Or you could just do what I do and use bio/virus 95% of the time because it's more powerful than pretty much any elemental spell and it's super quick for some reason. Overall, the ATB system works so well, it would be used for the next 6 mainline entries until it was changed in Final Fantasy X. Now let's take a moment to discuss one of the most notable portions of this game, the music. Now, the franchise had already established itself as having memorable themes, whether it be the ever-nostalgic prelude or the familiar bass lines ramping up the intensity in the battle themes. But Final Fantasy IV takes this to a whole new level. With the technological advancement of the Super Nintendo over the Nintendo is commonly remembered for its graphical improvements, it was also a marvel in its auditory capabilities. Nobuo Uematsu was also able to utilize 8 channels of high-fidelity sound over a dedicated sound chip processor, as opposed to the bleeps and bloops, or otherwise known as the triangle or square wave forms of the NES. The music in Final Fantasy IV is one of the first games that I felt really nailed a digital orchestration with so many memorable melodies, counter melodies, and otherwise impressive themes that blew the top off of what was considered the norm for RPGs of the time. Literally almost every single track in this game is worthy of praise. One of the standouts for me personally is the second battle theme, otherwise known as Boss Battle Theme. That is why I chose to remix this track for the entry's remix entitled Four Fiends Cocktail. For the multiple steps forward that Final Fantasy IV takes over its predecessor, there is one element that, in my opinion, really stood out as a step back. Gone is the versatility of selecting jobs or skills for each character. The skills characters of Final Fantasy IV have are specific to the character. They are usually determined by the character's background. Example being, since Kain is a dragoon, in the story he has the jump ability. Since Yang is a monk trained in martial arts, his unique ability is kick, and so forth. This pattern repeats itself for all of the player-controlled characters. Having characters with a specific skill set is a double-edged sword. While characters are set in stone, removing the option of customizing your party. The developers were able to build encounters around who would be in your party at certain times throughout the game. For instance, there are some battles where the enemy will charge up a devastating attack, but it can be interrupted with the strategic use of a certain ability like a jump or an elemental spell. Since the skills are tied to the characters that you have at the time, you will not run into the frustrating realization that your party does not have the required skills to proceed, saving you from unnecessarily grinding to learn them like we experienced in our Final Fantasy II playthrough. It is also much easier for the developers to balance the difficulty of the game and the encounters by limiting what is available to the player, allowing for a more consistent experience. Final Fantasy IV takes the Final Fantasy II approach of having a revolving cast of characters, but the difference is night and day in how it is implemented. In Final Fantasy II, you never cared about any new characters because not only did the party makeup change more often than a newborn's diaper, they had a fraction of the power that the rest of the party members had, making them about as useful as said used diaper. In Final Fantasy IV, every character feels as powerful as they should for the given encounters. Well, except for Edward, because he's a I want to take a moment and discuss the plethora of differences between the US release and the Japanese version. The US version removed the spells Protect, Shell, and Dispel. Various item costs were reduced. All of the specific items to cure status ailments such as the Gold Needle or Antidote were removed in favor of the Remedy item, which would only cost 100 gil in the US version versus 5,000 gil in the Japanese version. Many abilities were removed. Cecil's Darkness, Tella's Recall, Rosa's Prey, Palom's Buff, and several others. There were also a ton of aesthetic changes as well. During the rescue of Rosa, a scythe intended to kill her was turned into a big ball. The dev room that was hidden in the Dwarven Castle was removed. The religious imagery was removed. The spell Holy was renamed White. The Tower of Prayers in Mysidia was renamed the Tower of Wishes. And items like Phoenix Down, Remedy, and Potion were renamed to Life, Heal, and Cure 1, probably to tell the player what they did rather than what they are. Overall, many of the changes between the versions were made in an effort to make the game more approachable. I can only theorize that the simplification of Final Fantasy IV was an overcorrection based on the feedback from the US market on the difficult aspects of Final Fantasy I. This would not be the last time that a game was changed drastically for the US market. In fact, the very next entry that Square would release would take this exact same approach, not only for the US market, but for every market. So does Final Fantasy IV still hold up today? Absolutely. Literally every version of this game is a gem. Whether you want the more simplified experience of the SNES or US original, the 2014 3D remake, the Pixel remaster, or any of the other releases. In fact, the game has aged so well that the randomizers that exist for it are among my favorites that I've played. The free Enterprise randomizer manages to breathe new life into a game that already holds a massive amount of nostalgia for many. For many people, Final Fantasy IV was the first Final Fantasy game that they were able to experience. Final Fantasy IV is also my recommendation to play if you are new to the franchise, as it provides a reliable and enjoyable experience without overwhelming the player with new innovations or concepts. Our next entry in this video series is one that was 17 years in the making, so there is no possible way that with all of the developments in game design, technology, and storytelling, that it wouldn't deliver, right? Once again, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters, as producing all of these videos, songs, and playthroughs easily takes more time than a full-time job, so you guys are single-handedly funding my ability to keep the series going, and without you, I would not be able to do what I do today. And last but not least, once again, my fellow Warriors of Light, praise be to Yevon.